Over the vast sweep of Earth's history, the air we breathe has never been constant. Oxygen, the invisible force that fills our lungs and fuels life, has risen and fallen, shaping every organism, every ecosystem, and every evolutionary leap. There was a time when the atmosphere was supercharged, with oxygen levels soaring to 35%, far beyond what we know today. In that world, insects became giants, forests burned with fierce regularity, and life pushed boundaries previously unimagined. When oxygen fell, species adapted, some thrived, others vanished, and vertebrates rose to dominance. Oxygen dictated metabolism, size, speed, and even the rhythms of ecosystems, driving both opportunity and extinction. It sculpted lungs, hearts, and blood, setting the stage for warm-blooded animals and eventually humans. Our very brains, our energy, and the civilizations we build rely on this delicate balance. To understand life, we must understand the air itself, for oxygen is not merely a backdrop, but a central actor in the story of evolution, the silent force that has shaped the course of life on Earth in ways both visible and invisible. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. The air you breathe today is not the same air that life has always known. 21% oxygen fills each breath, steady and familiar, a balance that seems eternal. But Earth's atmosphere is not fixed. It has shifted, risen, and fallen through deep time. For millions of years, the very element that sustains us has existed in different proportions, shaping the course of life in ways both subtle and profound. Imagine a world where every inhalation carried not 21% oxygen, but 35%. A world where the air itself felt richer, where fire burned hotter, and where the boundaries of what living creatures could achieve expanded dramatically. Such a world existed more than 300 million years ago during the Carboniferous period. In that ancient time, oxygen levels surged to heights unknown in our modern age, creating conditions that no living human has ever experienced. The change did not arrive suddenly. It was the slow work of countless plants filling the sky with their waste, their photosynthesis turning sunlight into forests and forests into fuel for the atmosphere. Giant ferns, towering horsetails, and endless wetlands trapped carbon beneath the soil while releasing oxygen into the air. The balance tipped. Breath by breath, the atmosphere thickened with possibility until it reached a peak far beyond today's levels. This oxygen-rich environment reshaped evolution itself. Insects that today fit in the palm of your hand grew to the size of birds. Dragonflies stretched their wings nearly 2 feet across. Millipedes longer than a man coiled through the undergrowth. The physics of breathing had changed, and life seized the opportunity to grow larger, faster, and stronger than ever before. But oxygen is a double-edged gift. With 35% in the atmosphere, fire became a constant threat. Forests burned with a speed and intensity that modern flames cannot match. Every lightning strike could ignite a chain of destruction. In this world of abundance, survival depended not only on breathing, but on enduring the infernos that swept across ancient landscapes. The story of this oxygen surge is not simply about numbers in the air. It is about thresholds in evolution. When the composition of the atmosphere shifted, the very rules of life shifted with it. Mussels powered differently, predators hunted differently. Ecosystems thrived and collapsed in patterns unimaginable today. The world of 35% oxygen was a world both alien and familiar, a reminder that the breath we take for granted is not timeless. It is a product of history, a moment in a much larger story. And that story begins with the realization that the air itself can shape destiny. More than 2 billion years before the rise of forests, before insects, before any animal walked on land, the Earth was a different planet. Its oceans were green and murky, rich with dissolved iron. The sky above was heavy with methane and carbon dioxide. Oxygen, the gas we depend on, barely existed at all. For early life, this was not a problem. The first organisms thrived in a world without oxygen, using chemical energy to survive in the darkness of deep seas. Then, something remarkable happened. Tiny blue-green microbes, known as cyanobacteria, evolved a new way to capture energy. They used sunlight to split water molecules, releasing oxygen as a waste product. To them, it was nothing special. But to the planet, it was revolutionary. With every flicker of sunlight, with every bubbling cell, oxygen trickled into the air and the oceans. What began as a slow leak became one of the most important events in Earth's history. This was the Great Oxidation Event, a transformation so profound it reshaped the chemistry of the planet. At first, oxygen reacted with the iron in the oceans, turning the seas from green to rusty red as vast deposits of iron oxide settled onto the seafloor. These ancient iron formations, still visible in rocks today, are the silent record of that change. But eventually the sinks were filled, and oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere itself. For the first time, Earth had breathable air. For us, that sounds like a triumph, but for the microbes of that ancient world, it was catastrophe. Oxygen is reactive. To organisms adapted to an oxygen-free existence, it was toxic. Cells collapsed, lineages disappeared, and entire ecosystems were extinguished. The Great Oxidation Event was not only a revolution in chemistry, but it was also the planet's first mass extinction. Yet in the ruins of that microbial world, opportunity was born. Oxygen, so deadly to some, offered new pathways for energy. Breathing oxygen releases far more power than the old anaerobic ways. With it, cells could grow larger, organize into colonies, and eventually evolve into the complex ancestors of plants and animals. The very thing that destroyed countless species gave others the key to unimaginable futures. It is strange to think that one of the most important events in evolution was caused by some of the smallest organisms that ever lived. Cyanobacteria, drifting in shallow seas, turned sunlight into chemistry, and chemistry into history. By changing the air itself, they changed the destiny of life. The Great Oxidation Event reminds us that the atmosphere is not passive. It is an active force, shaping survival, extinction, and the possibilities of every breath that followed. Oxygen does more than keep us alive. It fuels the flames that consume forests, cities, and even entire landscapes. Without oxygen, fire cannot exist. It is the invisible partner in every spark, every ember, every blaze that has ever burned across the earth. To understand the power of oxygen is to understand the presence of fire and to see how the air itself can decide the fate of ecosystems. In today's world, with oxygen at about 21%, fire is possible but limited. Forests can burn, but flames require dry conditions, fuel, and the right spark. But imagine a world where oxygen rises to 30 or even 35%. In such an atmosphere, fire changes completely. Flames ignite faster, burn hotter, and spread with a ferocity that is almost unimaginable today. A single lightning strike in those times could unleash infernos that raced across entire landscapes. These conditions were not just occasional. During periods of high oxygen, such as the Carboniferous, the planet's forests stood like fuel stores waiting for the next spark. Vast swamps of ferns, horsetails, and towering lycophytes grew in dense abundance, locking carbon underground and filling the air with oxygen. But the very richness of that atmosphere also made them vulnerable. Fires swept through ancient ecosystems again and again, reshaping the land, clearing vegetation, and forcing life to adapt to cycles of destruction and renewal. The presence of constant fire altered the balance of evolution. Plants developed thicker bark, fire-resistant spores, and strategies to regrow quickly after being scorched. Some species thrived in the aftermath, taking advantage of the open sunlight and ash-rich soil left behind. Insects and animals, too, adapted to these fiery landscapes, learning to burrow, flee, or recolonize burned ground. Even long before humans discovered fire, the element was already a force of natural selection. But fire was more than destruction. It was also a driver of change. By consuming forests and clearing space, flames created diversity in ecosystems, allowing new species to find niches. They recycled nutrients back into the soil, maintaining fertility in places that might otherwise have grown stagnant. In a sense, fire was both the enemy and the architect of life. The story of fire is the story of oxygen. The two are inseparable, locked in a partnership that has shaped Earth's history for hundreds of millions of years. When oxygen levels rose, fire roared louder. When oxygen fell, fire quieted. Long before humans learned to control it, fire had already been sculpting the planet, fueled by nothing more than the air itself. 300 million years ago, the Earth was a very different place. The sky shimmered with an air far richer than what we breathe today, with oxygen levels reaching 30 to 35%. This abundance of oxygen transformed the possibilities of life in ways that seem almost impossible to imagine. Creatures that today would seem fantastical roamed the swamps and forests of the Carboniferous. The air itself allowed them to grow larger, to move faster, and to inhabit ecological niches that would be inconceivable in our modern atmosphere. In these ancient forests, insects and arthropods became giants. Dragonflies with wingspans of nearly 2 feet flitted through the canopy, their delicate bodies buoyed by the thick, oxygen-rich air. Centipedes, longer than a man, crept through the undergrowth, their many legs carrying them with a strength that could only exist in a world with so much oxygen. Millipedes, the size of small dogs, curled beneath ferns and club mosses, leaving traces of their movement imprinted in the soft soil. Even spiders and scorpions reached proportions that would seem terrifying to us today. The reason for this extraordinary growth lies in physiology. Insects rely on passive diffusion to deliver oxygen directly to their tissues. In a world with only 21% oxygen, diffusion limits the maximum size of their bodies. But when the atmosphere carries 35% oxygen, the limitations fall away. Cells can receive more oxygen more quickly, metabolism can increase, and muscles can power larger frames. In this environment, the constraints of the body are lifted, and life can stretch to unimaginable scales. The forests of the Carboniferous were themselves enormous, towering lycophytes and ferns forming a dense, humid canopy that provided shelter and food for these giants. Rivers and swamps flowed between the trees, teeming with early amphibians and arthropods, creating a complex web of life where size was both an advantage and a necessity. Predators grew to match the scale of their prey, and ecosystems became arenas for dramatic competition, survival, and adaptation. But oxygen was both gift and threat. The very same abundance that allowed creatures to become giants also made the forests prone to massive fires. Lightning or spontaneous ignition could turn a dense swamp into an inferno, challenging these enormous organisms to survive, flee, or adapt. Life in this era was a balance of power and peril, thriving in abundance yet constantly tested by the volatility of the environment. The Carboniferous world reminds us that the composition of the air can shape evolution itself. Oxygen was not just a component of life. It was a force that determined the scale, strength, and limits of existence. In that world, insects and arthropods became giants, and the Earth was a place where life pushed the boundaries of possibility, all because the air carried more of the very element that sustains every breath. The giants of the Carboniferous were not simply lucky. Their enormous size was the direct result of the air they breathed. Oxygen is the invisible thread that connects life to energy, and in the Carboniferous, that thread was thicker, richer, and more abundant than anything we know today. To understand how insects and arthropods achieved such massive proportions, we must look not at bones or muscles, but at the very way their bodies delivered oxygen to every cell. Insects do not have lungs like mammals. Instead, they rely on networks of tubes called tracheae, which carry oxygen directly from the air to tissues and organs. In today's 21% oxygen atmosphere, these tracheal systems impose strict limits on size. Diffusion, the process by which oxygen moves from the air into the body, becomes less efficient as distance increases. This is why insects today remain small. Their bodies cannot transport enough oxygen to power larger muscles or sustain greater mass. But in a world with 35% oxygen, diffusion worked differently. The air was dense with the very gas that fuels metabolism. Oxygen could travel further, reach deeper into tissues, and support larger bodies. Muscles could contract more forcefully, Hearts could beat more vigorously, and exoskeletons could grow heavier without crushing the organism. The tracheal system, once a limiting factor, became an enabling structure, allowing arthropods to scale up to sizes that would be impossible in modern air. Atmospheric chemistry played a silent but crucial role. The abundance of oxygen increased the partial pressure in the air, making every breath more effective. It is the same principle that allows humans to survive at high altitudes with supplemental oxygen or in hyperbaric chambers. The Carboniferous atmosphere provided nature's version of that support, and life responded in kind. Evolution pushed the boundaries, crafting creatures that filled ecological niches on a scale both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Yet this gigantism was temporary. As oxygen levels fell over millions of years, the limits returned. Arthropods shrank, their size constrained once more by the physics of diffusion. What had once been possible in an oxygen-rich world became impossible again, reminding us that evolution is shaped not only by genetics or competition, but by the very air that surrounds us. The physics of gigantism tells a deeper story. It shows how life is intertwined with the planet itself, how the chemistry of the atmosphere can enable or restrict the possibilities of biology. In those ancient forests, insects grew to the size of birds and millipedes to the length of humans, all because the air carried more oxygen than we could imagine. It is a lesson in the power of the invisible, a reminder that the smallest particles of gas can determine the grandest forms of life. The forests of the Carboniferous were unlike anything we see today. Vast swamps stretched for hundreds of miles, thick with ferns, towering horsetails, and club mosses that reached toward the sky like living pillars. The air was humid and heavy, filled with the scent of decaying plant matter and the quiet buzz of enormous insects. These forests were not just scenery. They were engines of transformation, shaping the chemistry of the planet and the course of evolution itself. Every leaf, every frond, every spore played a role in an invisible cycle. Through photosynthesis, the plants captured sunlight and converted carbon dioxide into energy, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. Over millions of years, this relentless production of oxygen thickened the atmosphere, creating the conditions that allowed insects and arthropods to grow to astonishing sizes. The very breath of these forests made gigantism possible, enabling life to explore new forms and new niches. But the influence of these forests went even deeper. Much of the carbon captured in their tissues did not return to the air. Instead, when plants died, they sank into the waterlogged swamps, accumulating in layers of peat and organic matter. The oxygen-rich atmosphere coexisted with the slow burial of carbon, locking it underground for millions of years. These buried forests would one day become the coal seams that fuel modern civilization, a legacy of the Carboniferous that stretches from biology to industry. The cycle of growth and burial also affected the climate. By removing carbon dioxide from the air, these swamps contributed to global cooling, altering weather patterns, sea levels, and the distribution of ecosystems. They created a world of stability and change, where evolutionary pressures acted in new ways. Predators and prey adapted to dense undergrowth, insects evolved to exploit new niches, and plants themselves competed not just for sunlight, but for space and survival in a world shaped by fire, decay, and burial. The forests were both architects and guardians. They built the air that allowed life to reach unprecedented scales, while quietly shaping the chemistry of the oceans, the atmosphere, and the soil. They were the foundation upon which the drama of life played out, a force as powerful as any predator or storm. The giants of the Carboniferous breathed because these forests lived, and the legacy of that life continues today every time we light a fire or dig coal from the ground. The story of the Carboniferous forests is a story of connection. Plants and air, decay and burial, oxygen and evolution all intertwined in a vast, slow-motion dance. They remind us that life does not exist in isolation. It is the product of environments, of chemistry, and of time. The forests that built the air built the possibilities of life, shaping not just the past, but the future of the planet in ways we are still discovering. In the dense, humid forests of the Carboniferous, arthropods reigned supreme. They were the rulers of an empire shaped not by intelligence or cunning, but by physiology and the abundance of oxygen in the air. The thick, rich atmosphere allowed them to grow to sizes that defy imagination, creating ecosystems where insects, spiders, scorpions, and millipedes became the giants of the land. Predators prowled through ferns and horsetails with a presence that would seem terrifying to us. Scorpions the size of dogs lurked in shadowed undergrowth, their pincers capable of crushing smaller creatures with ease. Their venom, designed to subdue prey, became a formidable tool in a world where strength and reach were amplified by oxygen. Millipedes stretched longer than a human, their many legs coiling through the mud and decaying plants, consuming vegetation at a scale modern ecosystems cannot support. Dragonflies, with wingspans approaching 2 feet, darted through the air like living gliders, hunting smaller insects with unmatched efficiency. Even spiders grew to proportions that allowed them to dominate the forest floor, weaving webs strong enough to ensnare prey that today would be considered impossibly large. Every niche in this world was filled with creatures whose size was dictated by the chemistry of the sky, whose power came from nothing more than the very air they breathed. The prey adapted as well. Smaller arthropods developed armor-like exoskeletons, spines, and speed to evade the larger predators that stalked them. Some burrowed into the soft, oxygen-rich soil to escape, while others climbed higher into the ferns and horsetails, exploiting the verticality of these ancient forests. Survival required constant vigilance, ingenuity, and an ability to thrive in an environment where both predator and prey could achieve enormous scale. This was a world without mammals, without birds, without the vertebrates that dominate ecosystems today. The invertebrates were unchallenged in their size and influence. They shaped the forests, the swamps, and even the microclimate of the Carboniferous by consuming plants, competing for space, and interacting with each other in complex, often brutal ways. Life was a game of giants, and oxygen was the rule-maker. The dominance of arthropods reminds us that evolution is not fixed. It responds to environment, chemistry, and opportunity. In a world of 35% oxygen, the invertebrate empire thrived, displaying forms and behaviors that would vanish once the air thinned. It is a testament to the power of atmosphere to shape life, a reminder that the size and scope of creatures are never determined by genetics alone, but by the invisible forces of the air itself. In the forests of the Carboniferous, the giants walked, crawled, and flew, and the earth itself seemed alive with their presence. In the shadow of the Carboniferous forests, another revolution was quietly underway. While insects and arthropods dominated the undergrowth and the skies, vertebrates were beginning to stake their claim on land. The abundance of oxygen in the atmosphere made this possible, providing a world in which lungs could operate at unprecedented efficiency. In this environment, amphibians, the first vertebrates to walk out of the water, grew larger, more active, and more diverse than they could have in today's thinner air. Early amphibians emerged from swamps and rivers, creatures built to navigate both water and land. Their lungs, supported by the high oxygen concentration, allowed them to sustain activity on land without relying solely on skin respiration. Muscles could contract more forcefully, hearts could pump blood more efficiently, and energy levels could remain high even as they explored new habitats. The oxygen-rich atmosphere transformed what had been aquatic animals into terrestrial pioneers. These early land vertebrates varied in size, some small and nimble, others reaching the proportions of modern alligators. They hunted insects, smaller arthropods, and even each other. Predatory forms developed strong jaws and robust limbs to chase prey across the uneven, mossy terrain. Their eggs, however, still required water, binding them to rivers, swamps, and ponds, and creating a close relationship between the terrestrial and aquatic environments that defined much of their ecology. The Carboniferous world was a crucible for experimentation. Oxygen allowed vertebrates to explore niches that were previously inaccessible. Lungs could deliver enough oxygen to support larger bodies, and the energy supplied by this abundance enabled more active predation, more complex movement, and more ambitious exploration of the land. Limbs evolved to support weight, allowing amphibians to crawl over fallen logs, burrow into soft earth, and climb over dense vegetation. They were creatures shaped not only by competition but by the very chemistry of the air. Interactions with giant arthropods were inevitable. Some amphibians became formidable predators, capable of challenging even the largest insects and centipedes. Others became prey, learning to hide, burrow, or escape to water when danger approached. Life on land was a balance of risk and opportunity, with oxygen levels determining the upper limits of what was possible. The rise of amphibians marks a pivotal chapter in the history of life. It shows how atmospheric conditions can enable new forms of existence, allowing vertebrates to move beyond water and begin the slow conquest of the land. In the lush, oxygen-rich forests of the Carboniferous, lungs thrived, muscles grew stronger, and a new generation of creatures began to explore a world that would one day be dominated by their descendants. Oxygen was the invisible force that lifted vertebrates out of water and gave them the freedom to walk, hunt, and shape the terrestrial landscapes of the ancient Earth. As amphibians spread across the lush, oxygen-rich landscapes of the Carboniferous, a new class of life began to emerge, the first true vertebrate predators on land. These were not the slow, cautious creatures that had first ventured from water. The surplus of oxygen in the atmosphere fueled activity in ways that would have been impossible in thinner air. Muscles could contract more powerfully, hearts could pump more efficiently, and metabolisms could sustain energy for long periods. Speed, agility, and stamina became tools for survival, turning these early vertebrates into formidable hunters. Predators prowled through mist-shrouded swamps and forests, their movements precise and deliberate. Limbs, strengthened by abundant oxygen, allowed them to pursue prey across uneven terrain, from muddy riverbanks to tangled undergrowth. Eyes adapted to detect movement in low light, scanning for the slightest flicker of an insect or the twitch of a millipede. The first land vertebrate hunters were not only strong, but alert and responsive. Their energy derived directly from the oxygen-saturated air that surrounded them. These predators filled an entirely new niche. Insects and arthropods had dominated for millions of years, reaching sizes that made them formidable in their own right. Now, vertebrate predators began challenging that supremacy. Some were ambush hunters, lying in wait beneath ferns or in the shadows of towering horsetails, striking with speed and precision. Others were active chasers, moving through swamps and shallow waters in pursuit of prey. Their metabolic intensity allowed them to sustain long hunts, a feature previously unimaginable for land-dwelling vertebrates. The impact of these predators reshaped the ecosystem. Insects, adapted by developing thicker exoskeletons, faster reflexes, and defensive behaviors. Millipedes, scorpions, and giant dragonflies were forced into new patterns of movement and activity. Predation pressure created an arms race that accelerated evolution, driving adaptations in both predator and prey. The Carboniferous world became a theater of tension, where survival demanded constant vigilance, rapid reaction, and remarkable endurance. Oxygen was the invisible architect behind this drama. It made possible the energy, speed, and resilience that distinguished these hunters from their aquatic ancestors. Every breath powered muscles and nerves, transforming once sluggish creatures into active agents of predation. The surplus of oxygen did not merely support life on land. It expanded the very limits of what life could achieve, unlocking behaviors, forms, and interactions that would shape ecosystems for millions of years. The first vertebrate predators in the mist were a harbinger of change. They marked the beginning of complex food webs on land, the rise of ecological strategies based on speed, endurance, and aggression. In a world where oxygen flowed freely through every cell, life was no longer constrained by limits of energy or size. It was free to chase, to hunt, and to dominate, setting the stage for the extraordinary diversity and drama of terrestrial life that lay ahead. The world of the Carboniferous was a place of extremes. Oxygen filled the air at levels far higher than anything we experience today, a gift that allowed life to grow bigger, faster, and more active. But it was a gift, laced with danger. The very atmosphere that fueled gigantism and metabolic power also made the land combustible. Forests burned with a ferocity that would have been unimaginable in later eras, as the high oxygen content allowed flames to ignite and spread with astonishing speed. Lightning strikes, volcanic activity, or even simple friction could set entire swamps alight, consuming vast stretches of vegetation in hours. These fires reshaped ecosystems repeatedly, creating a dynamic and sometimes brutal environment. Predators and prey alike had to contend not only with each other, but with the unpredictability of fire. Giant insects could flee the flames by flying or burrowing. Amphibians sought refuge in ponds or beneath decaying logs, and the resilient ferns and horsetails that dominated the forest floor evolved to regrow quickly from root systems, able to survive repeated burns. Survival required not just strength or speed, but an ability to adapt to a world where the air itself could become lethal. Oxygen did not only influence fire, its fluctuations had long-term consequences for life on Earth. When levels dipped even slightly, the largest insects and amphibians suffered first, their enormous bodies unable to function efficiently in thinner air. Metabolic rates slowed, activity decreased, and the predator-prey balance shifted. Entire populations could collapse, forcing rapid evolutionary responses or local extinctions. Conversely, small increases in oxygen spurred sudden growth and activity, enabling bursts of ecological experimentation that reshaped forests, swamps, and waterways. Life existed on a knife's edge, a fragile balance dictated by the chemistry of the sky. Adaptation became the currency of survival. Creatures developed behaviors to cope with fire, such as burrowing deeper, seeking refuge in water, or moving rapidly across the landscape. Plants evolved thick bark, spore dispersal strategies, and rapid regeneration to recover from repeated burns. Oxygen dictated not only physiology but ecology, influencing the structure of food webs, competition, and habitat use. It was an invisible force that governed life at every level, from cellular respiration to the migration of the largest predators. The Carboniferous world reminds us that abundance carries risk. Oxygen, essential to life, was also volatile, shaping evolution in ways that were both constructive and destructive. The forests, the swamps, the giant arthropods and amphibians all existed in a delicate equilibrium, sustained by plentiful air but constantly threatened by its extremes. In this oxygen-rich world, survival depended on adaptation, vigilance, and the ability to navigate a planet where opportunity and danger were inseparable, and the balance of life could shift with every breath. As the Carboniferous drew to a close, the atmosphere began to change. Oxygen, once abundant and empowering, started to decline. The very air that had allowed insects, millipedes, and scorpions to reach unimaginable sizes became thinner, less supportive of the gigantic forms that had ruled the forests and swamps. Gradually, the era of colossal arthropods came to an end, not through sudden catastrophe, but through the subtle, relentless constraints of chemistry. As oxygen levels fell, their bodies could no longer sustain the energy needed for such immense size. Limbs grew slower, muscles weakened, and metabolisms faltered. Creatures that had once soared, crawled, and hunted with overwhelming dominance found themselves constrained, confined to smaller forms that could function in the thinning air. The collapse of the giants reshaped ecosystems. Predatory arthropods that had ruled the undergrowth were replaced by vertebrates capable of greater endurance and flexibility. Amphibians, still dependent on moist environments, gave way to early reptiles that could exploit drier, more varied habitats. The decline of massive invertebrates opened ecological niches that vertebrates were ready to fill, allowing them to expand, diversify, and eventually dominate terrestrial life. Vertebrate hunters, once minor players in the shadow of enormous insects, became the apex predators. Their success fueled by lungs capable of extracting oxygen efficiently, even as atmospheric levels dropped. Smaller arthropods continued to thrive, but the dramatic, awe-inspiring forms that had defined the Carboniferous vanished. Dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans shrank to sizes familiar to us today, millipedes that had rivaled humans in length disappeared, and scorpions lost their overwhelming bulk. Evolution, always responsive to environmental pressures, favored creatures that could survive in a less oxygen-rich world. With diminished size came changes in behavior, reproduction, and predation strategies. Survival no longer depended on sheer bulk, but on adaptability, intelligence, and metabolic efficiency. This transition illustrates the intimate connection between life and the atmosphere. Changes in oxygen levels dictated not just which species survived, but which body plans, behaviors, and ecologies were possible. The giants of the Carboniferous were a vivid reminder of what the planet's chemistry could allow, and their disappearance marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Vertebrates began to fill roles once occupied by arthropod titans, setting the stage for the rise of mammals, birds, and reptiles. The collapse of the giants was not a failure but a transformation, a reshaping of life driven by the invisible hand of oxygen, reminding us that evolution is always tethered to the shifting composition of the air we breathe. As oxygen levels began to decline after the Carboniferous, life faced a new challenge. The once generous atmosphere could no longer support the enormous bodies of arthropods or sustain the explosive energy of the largest amphibians. Vertebrates, however, had an advantage: lungs, hearts, and blood that could adapt to scarcity. The physiology of breathing became a battlefield of efficiency, a negotiation between the body and the thinning air. Lungs evolved to maximize the extraction of oxygen, developing larger surface areas, more intricate branching, and the ability to ventilate continuously. Air flowed more efficiently through alveoli, allowing each breath to deliver the maximum possible oxygen to the bloodstream. The heart evolved alongside the lungs, becoming more powerful and capable of circulating oxygen with greater speed and precision. The coupling of lung and heart allowed vertebrates to sustain activity even when oxygen was scarce. Blood chemistry transformed as well. Hemoglobin, the molecule responsible for transporting oxygen, underwent subtle but crucial changes. Its affinity for oxygen increased in ways that allowed it to pick up even the smallest amounts from the lungs and deliver them to tissues far more efficiently. The very molecules of life were tuned to scarcity, capable of extracting energy from an environment that was no longer abundantly generous. Efficiency replaced sheer abundance. Where once size and strength were dictated by the generosity of the atmosphere, now survival depended on precision and adaptability. Vertebrates that could breathe deeply, circulate blood effectively, and extract oxygen efficiently thrived. Those that could not faded into extinction. The decline of atmospheric oxygen was not a catastrophe but a sculptor, reshaping the physiology of land animals, favoring those built for endurance, sustained activity, and metabolic ingenuity. These adaptations had cascading effects on behavior and ecology. Vertebrates could explore drier habitats, move longer distances, and hunt with greater strategy rather than relying solely on brute force. Limbs could be more agile because muscles could operate on smaller, more efficient doses of oxygen. Activity patterns changed, favoring sustained effort over short bursts. Predator-prey interactions evolved to include endurance chases and tactical retreats, reflecting the limits imposed by a thinner sky. The lesson of this transition is profound. Life is not merely a function of opportunity but of constraint. The atmosphere sets the stage, and the body must learn to perform within its limits. Lungs, hearts, and blood became instruments of survival, finely tuned to a world where oxygen was a precious resource. In this era, vertebrates learned to thrive not through abundance, but through efficiency, a lesson written in the very molecules that carried life from breath to tissue, shaping the future of terrestrial existence for millions of years to come. As the Permian gave way to the Mesozoic, a new era dawned. Reptiles, once small and limited by environmental constraints, began to explore opportunities that had been denied to their amphibian ancestors. Dinosaurs emerged into a world where oxygen levels fluctuated, sometimes generous, sometimes lean. These shifts shaped not only the size and behavior of these creatures, but the very innovations that allowed them to dominate terrestrial ecosystems for millions of years. In periods of higher oxygen, metabolic power increased. Muscles could sustain greater effort, and activity levels soared. Gigantism became achievable, but only through a combination of physiological adaptation and environmental opportunity. Lungs and circulatory systems evolved to meet the demands of enormous bodies. Hollow bones reduced weight without sacrificing strength, allowing massive creatures to move with surprising agility. Air sacs, similar to those in modern birds, permitted a continuous flow of oxygen through the lungs, maximizing extraction efficiency even when atmospheric levels dropped. Hearts developed to circulate blood more effectively, sustaining distant extremities with oxygen-rich fluid. Hemoglobin and other oxygen-binding proteins became more efficient, finely tuned to the shifting chemistry of the air. These adaptations allowed some dinosaurs to reach staggering sizes, towering over the forests, plains, and swamps of their world. Fluctuating oxygen also shaped behavior. During oxygen-rich periods, predators could engage in long chases, hunters could sustain bursts of speed, and herbivores could graze extensively without fatigue. When oxygen dipped, animals relied on endurance and strategy rather than raw power. Migration patterns emerged as species moved to exploit regions where air density and resources provided optimal conditions for growth and survival. Ecological relationships became complex, with predator-prey interactions, competition, and territoriality all influenced by the invisible hand of atmospheric chemistry. The age of reptiles also reveals the link between physiology and evolution. Gigantism was not merely the result of time and opportunity. It was the product of adaptations that allowed bodies to function in fluctuating oxygen conditions. Bones, muscles, lungs, and blood evolved in concert, each innovation enabling the next. Behavior, diet, and habitat use followed the constraints imposed by the air itself, illustrating that evolution is both opportunistic and reactive. Dinosaurs dominated because they could navigate the extremes of their world. Oxygen-rich periods allowed explosive growth and activity. Oxygen-poor periods favored efficiency and endurance. This interplay created a dynamic ecosystem where size, speed, and strategy coexisted, shaping the long reign of the reptiles. In every breath, every step, the influence of atmospheric oxygen was apparent, guiding the evolution of giants and ensuring that the Mesozoic would be remembered as the age where physiology and environment merged to produce some of the most remarkable creatures Earth has ever known. The evolution of warm-bloodedness, or endothermy, represents one of the most profound shifts in vertebrate life. It allowed animals to maintain a constant body temperature, to be active when others rested, and to occupy niches that were previously inaccessible. Yet this remarkable adaptation did not emerge in isolation. It was intimately connected to the availability of oxygen in the atmosphere. High oxygen levels provided the energetic margin necessary for metabolic experimentation, allowing early mammals and birds to explore ways of generating heat internally rather than relying on the environment. In periods of oxygen abundance, the physiological costs of maintaining a high metabolism were less prohibitive. Muscles could contract more forcefully, hearts could pump blood at higher rates, and lungs could extract sufficient oxygen to sustain constant activity. Early endotherms were able to fuel intense metabolic processes, supporting behaviors that would have been impossible in a low-oxygen world. They could forage for longer periods, escape predators more effectively, and exploit environments that fluctuated in temperature, from sunlit forests to cooler, shaded undergrowth. This experimentation with metabolism drove innovations in the circulatory and respiratory systems. Hearts became more efficient, with separate chambers to prevent the mixing of oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood. Lungs evolved finer structures to maximize oxygen absorption, and the blood itself carried oxygen more efficiently through hemoglobin with higher affinity. Fur and feathers appeared not just as insulation but as extensions of this metabolic transformation, helping organisms conserve the heat generated internally. These adaptations were costly in terms of energy, but the richness of the atmosphere made the costs sustainable, providing a stage for warm-bloodedness to take root. The consequences of endothermy extended beyond physiology. Warm-blooded animals could remain active at night, when cooler temperatures limited the activity of ectotherms. They could migrate, hunt, and care for offspring in conditions that would have been inhospitable to cold-blooded creatures. Endothermy allowed behavioral flexibility, social complexity, and higher levels of intelligence, setting the stage for the eventual rise of mammals and birds as dominant terrestrial vertebrates. Oxygen levels acted as a silent architect, shaping the limits and possibilities of life. When the air was rich, metabolism could accelerate, and warm-bloodedness became feasible. The interplay of chemistry and biology created a feedback loop. Higher oxygen allowed more energetic lifestyles, which in turn drove further adaptations in respiratory, circulatory, and thermal systems. The rise of endothermy was not inevitable, but it became possible because the world provided the necessary fuel, and life responded with ingenuity. In every breath, in every heartbeat, the signature of oxygen's generosity can be traced, revealing how this invisible element set the stage for some of the most remarkable experiments in evolution. Mass extinctions are the punctuation marks of Earth's history, moments when the delicate balance of life faltered and entire ecosystems collapsed. At the heart of these crises lies a complex interplay of atmospheric chemistry, climate, and biology. And oxygen often plays a starring role. When oxygen levels fluctuated dramatically, the consequences rippled through every corner of the biosphere. Species that had thrived under generous air suddenly found themselves gasping, limited by a resource that had once been abundant. Ecosystems faltered, predators starved, prey vanished, and the web of life was rewoven under harsher constraints. Oxygen is not merely a gas, it is the currency of metabolism. It determines the pace at which organisms can move, grow, and reproduce. When oxygen dipped, even the most robust animals faced physiological stress. Muscles lost endurance, hearts labored, and lungs struggled to extract enough life-sustaining air. Species that had evolved to exploit high oxygen conditions, such as giant arthropods or massive amphibians, could no longer meet the energetic demands of their bodies. Their size, once a triumph of abundance, became a liability. Many collapsed under their own weight or fell prey to more adaptable creatures. The Permian-Triassic extinction, around 252 million years ago, offers a stark illustration. Oxygen levels in the oceans plummeted, creating widespread hypoxia that suffocated marine life. Coral reefs and bivalves, which relied on stable oxygen concentrations, disappeared almost entirely. On land, the same atmospheric stressors exacerbated droughts, intensified wildfires, and transformed landscapes. Reptiles, amphibians, and early synapsids faced shrinking habitats and fierce competition. Those that survived were often smaller, more efficient, and better adapted to low oxygen conditions. Evolution was forced to favor efficiency over extravagance, endurance over size. Oxygen fluctuations also interacted with carbon cycles and climate. High levels of carbon dioxide amplified greenhouse conditions, warming the planet, while low oxygen limited the atmosphere's ability to buffer heat and maintain stability. Plants struggled to photosynthesize efficiently, leading to reduced food availability and further stressing herbivores. The knock-on effects cascaded up the food chain, intensifying mortality among predators. Extinction was not a single event but a systemic failure, a chain reaction triggered by the invisible dynamics of the air itself. Yet even in catastrophe, oxygen shaped the path forward. Survivors carried adaptations that would define the next era. Smaller body sizes, more efficient lungs, hemoglobin with higher oxygen affinity, and metabolic flexibility became hallmarks of resilience. Life learned to navigate scarcity, to endure periods of low oxygen without collapsing. This pattern repeats across Earth's history. Each mass extinction is both an end and a beginning, a thinning of the tree of life that leaves room for new branches to grow, new forms to experiment with the limits of physiology and metabolism. The story of oxygen and extinction is a reminder that the atmosphere is not a passive backdrop. It is an active participant in evolution, capable of nurturing life to extremes and of enforcing brutal limits. When oxygen dips, ecosystems tremble, and survival becomes a contest of adaptation. The ghosts of vanished species linger in the fossil record, teaching us that life is at once fragile and endlessly inventive, forever shaped by the invisible currents of the air we breathe. While dinosaurs ruled the Mesozoic landscapes with imposing size and strength, a quieter drama unfolded in the shadows. Small mammals, often no larger than a rat or a weasel, navigated a world dominated by giants. Their survival required ingenuity rather than power, flexibility rather than brute force. They inhabited burrows, crept through dense underbrush, and foraged at night, avoiding predators that could crush them without effort. Oxygen levels, sometimes lower than the periods that had fueled gigantism, created a challenging environment, one that demanded efficiency in every breath, every movement. These early mammals were physiologically remarkable, even if inconspicuous. Endothermy, the ability to maintain a constant body temperature, gave them a distinct advantage. In fluctuating climates, when oxygen dipped or temperatures fell, mammals could remain active when other creatures slowed or became dormant. Their lungs, finely tuned to extract oxygen efficiently, and their circulatory systems, capable of sustaining higher metabolic rates, allowed them to thrive in conditions that would have stifled larger reptiles. Hemoglobin molecules evolved to carry oxygen more effectively, supporting activity and endurance that relied on consistency rather than sheer atmospheric abundance. Behaviorally, these mammals exploited niches that dinosaurs could not. Nocturnal habits reduced predation risk and allowed access to food sources untouched during the day. Burrowing provided shelter from both predators and environmental extremes, creating microhabitats where oxygen concentration was stable, humidity consistent, and temperatures buffered. These small refuges became laboratories of adaptation, spaces where mammals could experiment with reproduction, social behavior, and diet without immediate threat from the dominant reptiles. In addition to physical and behavioral adaptations, sensory and cognitive capacities developed. Enhanced olfactory and auditory systems allowed mammals to navigate in low light, detect predators, and locate hidden food. Larger brain-to-body ratios supported complex behaviors and learning, traits that would prove crucial once the age of dinosaurs ended. Each generation reinforced the advantages of efficiency and adaptability, traits that could be passed on even as environmental conditions shifted unpredictably. The constraints of oxygen shaped their evolution subtly but decisively. While high oxygen had permitted the gigantism of arthropods and reptiles, lower or fluctuating levels selected for efficiency, endurance, and metabolic control. Small mammals could survive on less, move silently, and reproduce under conditions where larger creatures struggled. These traits were not immediately spectacular, but they set the stage for an extraordinary evolutionary opportunity. When the Mesozoic ended, when catastrophic events erased many of the giants from the land, mammals were ready. They were poised to occupy the niches left vacant, carrying with them the physiological sophistication honed in the shadows. The story of mammals during the reign of dinosaurs is one of patience and preparation. While the giants captured the imagination of the ages, it was the small, adaptable, oxygen-efficient mammals who quietly refined the tools of survival. Lungs, hearts, metabolism, and behavior all aligned with the invisible dictates of the air, demonstrating that dominance is not always defined by size. In the shadows of the dinosaurs, mammals learned to breathe efficiently, move quietly, and endure extremes. These lessons, forged in a low-oxygen, high-risk world, would become the foundation of their future triumphs, shaping the rise of mammals in the age that followed. The end of the Permian, some 252 million years ago, marked one of the most severe bottlenecks in the history of life. Oxygen levels in both the atmosphere and the oceans dropped precipitously, creating a world in which breathing itself became a formidable challenge. For creatures accustomed to higher concentrations, every inhalation carried less life than before. Muscles that had powered enormous predators or sustained long migrations faltered. Heart rates slowed, energy expenditure became perilous, and survival was measured not in strength or size, but in the ability to endure scarcity at a cellular level. Life itself was being filtered by air. Hypoxia, the scarcity of oxygen, reshaped ecosystems from the bottom up. In the oceans, massive die-offs struck corals, mollusks, and brachiopods. Reefs that had once flourished crumbled, leaving behind skeletons and empty niches. Marine predators, reliant on constant oxygen supply to sustain their hunting, struggled as metabolism faltered. Fish that had once dominated shallow seas were replaced by smaller, more efficient species that could survive in oxygen-depleted waters. This was not a gradual culling. It was a rapid, sweeping change that reshaped entire food webs in a geological heartbeat. On land, the story was no less dramatic. Large amphibians and reptiles, their metabolisms tuned to relatively high oxygen levels, could not maintain sustained activity. Movements became sluggish, endurance diminished, and predation patterns shifted as the formerly dominant giants weakened. Smaller, adaptable creatures, especially the emerging mammals and synapsids, found opportunities in niches left vacant by the collapse of larger competitors. Burrows and shaded refuges became critical lifelines, providing oxygen microclimates in an otherwise harsh world. The bottleneck favored efficiency over extravagance, endurance over size, and innovation over sheer power. Oxygen scarcity also exerted selective pressure on physiology in profound ways. Hemoglobin affinity for oxygen became a critical determinant of survival. Lungs evolved greater surface area. Tracheal systems in smaller creatures became more refined, and circulatory systems adapted to deliver oxygen to tissues more effectively. Creatures that could tolerate low oxygen or rapidly adjust to its fluctuations survived. Those that could not were lost, leaving a fossil record marked by abrupt disappearances and a stark thinning of lineages. Life was being filtered, generation by generation, by the invisible composition of the air itself. The Triassic period, following the Permian extinction, continued the story of oxygen stress. Atmospheric levels remained unstable, and early dinosaurs and reptiles evolved under these fluctuating conditions. Species that thrived were those capable of maintaining metabolic function under hypoxia, whether through behavioral adaptation, nocturnal activity, or physiologic refinement. This oxygen bottleneck was not merely a crisis, it was an evolutionary crucible. It forced life to innovate, to streamline, to specialize. The survivors carried traits that would define their descendants for millions of years, shaping the rise of dinosaurs, the endurance of mammals, and the intricate balance of ecosystems that would follow. The lesson of the oxygen bottleneck is clear. Air is not a passive backdrop for life. It is an active force, a filter that separates the resilient from the vulnerable. Entire lineages were pruned, entire ecosystems reshaped, not by predators, not by climate alone, but by the very composition of the atmosphere. Survival depended on the ability to extract, transport, and utilize oxygen efficiently. Life learned to endure scarcity, to innovate under pressure, and to persist in a world where the air itself had become a gatekeeper. The bottleneck was brutal, but it was also formative, setting the stage for the dominance of those species that could breathe, adapt, and thrive in a world of constraint. After hundreds of millions of years of fluctuation, the atmosphere began to stabilize. Oxygen levels, which had once surged to nearly 35% and then plummeted during catastrophic bottlenecks, settled closer to the levels we recognize today, around 21%. The era of atmospheric extremes had passed, and with it, the conditions that had allowed extraordinary gigantism among insects, arthropods, and some reptiles began to wane. Forests no longer burned with the same ferocity, fires became less pervasive, and ecosystems simplified into patterns more familiar to the modern observer. The sprawling coal swamps of the Carboniferous shrank, and the giant millipedes, enormous dragonflies, and colossal scorpions that had dominated the land began to disappear, replaced by creatures better adapted to steady, moderate air. This return to balance did not erase the effects of high oxygen experiments, however. Life had been forged under extreme conditions, and the lessons of gigantism, endurance, and metabolic adaptation were encoded into evolution itself. Vertebrates that had survived hypoxic bottlenecks retained lungs, hearts, and circulatory systems optimized for efficiency. Traits that would support the rise of mammals, birds, and later dinosaurs of moderate size. Insects, now smaller but no less versatile, carried with them the structural innovations that had allowed them to thrive in a hyper-oxygenated world. The planet was quieter in scale, but richer in the diversity of life strategies and physiological adaptations honed over eons of experimentation. Ecosystems simplified in appearance, Yet complexity persisted in function. Predatory hierarchies became more defined, and niches once occupied by massive arthropods were gradually filled by reptiles, amphibians, and early mammals. Forests matured with more predictable cycles, rivers flowed with steadier currents, and oxygen-dependent processes stabilized. Plants no longer needed to outpace catastrophic fires with extraordinary growth rates, and herbivores could subsist without pushing their lungs and circulatory systems to the absolute limits. The environment became one in which survival depended less on brute physical adaptation to the air itself and more on behavioral flexibility, reproductive strategy, and subtle physiological refinement. Despite the moderation of oxygen, the legacy of its past abundance continued to echo. Metabolic capacities, respiratory efficiency, and circulatory sophistication provided a platform upon which more complex and adaptable life forms could evolve. Mammals learned to regulate temperature and oxygen usage with remarkable precision. Birds developed high-efficiency lungs and air sacs that would one day enable flight at altitudes where oxygen is thin. Even plants exhibited traits that reflected the memory of extreme oxygen, from robust vascular systems to optimized photosynthetic pathways. Life had been tested in the crucible of excess and scarcity, and what emerged was resilient, versatile, and capable of enduring conditions far beyond the extremes of any single era. The stabilization of oxygen marked a turning point in the story of life. The planet was no longer a world of extremes, yet the innovations born from those extremes persisted in every lineage, every ecosystem, every breath. Gigantism faded, fires became manageable, and ecosystems settled into a rhythm that could support complexity without chaos. Evolution had been shaped, refined, and primed by the experiments of high oxygen, and the world that emerged was prepared for the next chapters of life, for the rise of mammals, the age of dinosaurs, and eventually, for the species that would one day contemplate the very air they breathe. Humans emerged into a world where oxygen levels had stabilized, a planet no longer subject to the extremes that had shaped the evolution of giants and hyperactive arthropods. We were born into an atmosphere hovering around 21%, a concentration that is sufficient to support complex life, yet delicate enough that small changes could ripple through ecosystems and human physiology alike. Our lungs, hearts, and circulatory systems are tuned to this precise balance. Even a slight decrease in oxygen triggers physiological stress, elevates heart rates, and forces the body to adapt in real time. The very air we breathe is not merely a backdrop for life. It is an active participant, shaping how we move, think, and survive. The human brain is perhaps the most oxygen-dependent organ on Earth. It consumes roughly 20% of the body's oxygen supply, despite accounting for only a fraction of body mass. Every thought, every memory, every action depends on a steady delivery of oxygen to fuel neurons. Our capacity for creativity, planning, language, and abstract reasoning is intimately tied to the availability of this gas. Without it, neurons falter, cognitive processes slow, and consciousness itself becomes fragile. The oxygen that surged through the atmosphere hundreds of millions of years ago set the stage for larger, more active creatures with high metabolic demands. In many ways, our own complex physiology is an echo of those ancient experiments, a delicate balance between supply and demand, efficiency and necessity. Beyond individual physiology, oxygen shapes the very structure of human society. Agriculture, industry, and urbanization all depend on a steady flow of energy, and energy depends on oxygen. Fire, a tool that allowed humans to cook, forge metal, and alter landscapes, is impossible without oxygen. Our ability to generate heat, to smelt ores, to burn fuels and light cities, all relies on maintaining chemical reactions that require this invisible gas. Modern civilization, from skyscrapers to hospitals, from transportation networks to power plants, is built on the foundation of oxygen-dependent chemistry. The same element that once allowed dragonflies to grow to 2 feet in wingspan now fuels our machines, our industries, and even the chemical reactions within every cell. Oxygen's influence extends even to the scale of human survival in extreme environments. At high altitudes, where atmospheric pressure is lower and oxygen is scarce, Our bodies must adapt to avoid hypoxia. Red blood cells increase, hemoglobin shifts its affinity, and ventilation rises. We engineer supplemental oxygen systems for space, submarines, and medical emergencies because even a temporary disruption in supply can be catastrophic. Civilization itself is a response to the constraints imposed by air. Cities, transportation, and medicine all function as extensions of our need to manage oxygen, to ensure that every cell, every organ, continues to perform its vital work. Our evolutionary story and our modern story are inseparable from the availability of oxygen. It defines limits, enables innovation, and imposes consequences for mismanagement. The gas that once drove gigantism, shaped metabolic pathways, and forced organisms to adapt is now quietly sustaining every heartbeat, every thought, every action. As we look to the skies, to the atmosphere, and to the future, it becomes clear that humans are not masters of oxygen but dependents. We inherit the experiments of eons past, the balance achieved through millennia of ecological and atmospheric shifts, and we live within its invisible, life-giving embrace. Oxygen has never been a passive component of life. It is more than a gas in the atmosphere, it is a force that has shaped every twist and turn of evolution. At 35%, it transformed the planet into a place of extremes, a world where insects could grow larger than small dogs and arthropods moved with astonishing speed and energy. Forests became tinderboxes, and fire raged across landscapes, sculpting ecosystems in ways that no other element could. This abundance of oxygen did not simply sustain life, it drove it, creating pressures and opportunities that forced adaptation, innovation, and sometimes extinction. Life experimented with scale, metabolism, and activity in ways unimaginable in today's 21% world. The giants of the Carboniferous, the fast-moving predators that stalked misty wetlands, the sprawling forests that locked carbon underground and released oxygen into the sky, all were products of an atmosphere that was itself a player in the game of evolution. Yet oxygen's power is dual. Where it fosters growth and energy, it also imposes limits and risks. Too much oxygen makes fire more frequent, more intense, and less forgiving. Ecosystems could collapse under sudden shifts. Species that thrived under abundance suddenly found themselves vulnerable when levels fell. The gigantic arthropods of the past disappeared, their size and metabolism no longer supported by the declining atmosphere. Vertebrates, more adaptable to these fluctuations, began to take dominance. The rise and fall of oxygen dictated the winners and losers, a subtle yet unyielding hand guiding the course of life. Evolution itself was filtered not just by competition, not just by predation, but by the very air that filled the lungs of the planet's creatures. Oxygen shaped not only the scale of life but also its internal machinery. Lungs, hearts, blood, and metabolic systems evolved in direct response to the availability of this gas. Species that could use oxygen efficiently survived when scarcity struck. Warm-blooded mammals and birds arose with metabolic rates and respiratory systems tuned to fluctuations that would have crippled other organisms. Oxygen influenced the emergence of behaviors, predation strategies, and even the development of nervous systems capable of sustaining activity and intelligence. Life's complexity is inseparable from oxygen's influence, and the experiments of past atmospheric conditions left lasting imprints on every lineage that followed. In humans, the story continues. Our brains, our energy-intensive tissues, and even our civilizations rely on the careful balance of oxygen. The fires we light, the machines we run, the medical technologies we develop, all are possible because we have learned to manage and manipulate an element that was once a sculptor of giants. Yet the lessons remain clear. Oxygen is a resource, a constraint, a driver of possibility. It has created monsters and giants, carved paths for vertebrates, and filtered the lineages that survive. It determines what life can attempt and what it must abandon. As we reflect on the journey from 35% atmospheres to the world we inhabit today, one truth emerges. Oxygen is not a backdrop to evolution. It is a partner, a force, and a measure of life's potential. It has set limits and opened doors, dictated survival and opportunity, and continues to define the possibilities of life on Earth. From the Carboniferous swamps to the forests and deserts of today, from the wings of dragonflies to the neurons of the human brain, oxygen has shaped the path of life. It is the breath of evolution itself, the invisible current that moves through time, shaping every living thing in its wake.